The old man arrived at the Kettle Creek Bowman Range on a Saturday morning in late October, driving a '98 Chevy pickup with a cracked rear window and a faded powder Meyer decal on the bumper. He was 76 years old. His name was August Bernard Holloway, and nobody there knew who he was. He parked at the far end of the gravel lot, away from the truck clusters and the tailgate conversations, and he sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, the way a man does when he is settling something inside himself before he steps out into the world. Then he climbed down from the cab, opened the side panel of a homemade wooden tool chest bolted to the bed, and lifted out a recurve bow that had no business being at a modern 3D archery competition. It was a Bear Kodiak Hunter, vintage 1962. 64 inches of laminated maple and fiberglass, the riser worn to a soft grey where his grip had polished the finish away over 40 years of use. No sight, no stabilizer, no arrow rest except a small piece of leather stitched to the shelf by hand. The quiver was canvas, army surplus olive drab, and the arrows in it were cedar, hand-fletched with real turkey feathers, that he had cut and split himself in a workshop behind his house in Harlan County, Kentucky. He set the bow against the truck door and pulled a flannel shirt over his thermal undershirt and buttoned it to the throat. The morning was cold enough to see breath. 3 lanes over, a group of 8 or 9 competitors in their late 20s and early 30s were running through warm-up shots on a foam elk target at 40 yards. Their bows were carbon-limbed compounds loaded with mechanical sights, vibration dampeners, wrist slings, and release aids that clicked with the precision of a fine trigger. Most of them wore branded performance gear and had range bags that cost more than August Bernard Holloway's monthly utility bill. They were good shooters. They trained hard. They argued about draw weights and spine tolerances and aerodynamic flex the way their grandfathers had argued about carburetor jets and ignition timing, with that particular combination of genuine knowledge and the need to demonstrate it. One of them, a broad-shouldered young man named Jeff Sutter, who had won the Kentucky Open the previous spring, looked over at the old man pulling a cedar arrow from a canvas quiver and said something to the shooter beside him, not loud enough to carry, but the laughter that followed did. Another one, a redhead in a Hoyt archery hoodie whose name was Brendan Coyle, called across the lane in a voice pitched to be friendly but shaped like a point. "Hey, Pop, you sure you're at the right event? Trad shoots not until February." More laughter. Easy laughter, the kind that doesn't think about itself. August Bernard Holloway looked up from his quiver. He looked at Brendan Coyle for exactly 1 second, the way a man looks at the weather, taking stock, not reacting, and then he looked back down and pulled a cedar shaft through his fingers to check the knock. He did not say a word. Before I tell you what happened when August Bernard Holloway stepped to the first stake, I need to ask you something. If you believe that a man who gave 30 years of his life to this country deserves better than a punchline in a parking lot, type the word service in the comments right now. Type it for the men and women who came home from places the rest of us only read about in textbooks, and then went back to quiet lives in small towns, carrying things they never talk about at dinner. Type it for the ones we forget to look at twice. Now let me tell you who August Bernard Holloway actually was, because nobody at Kettle Creek that morning had the faintest idea. He was born in 1948 in a coal camp holler outside Harlan, Kentucky, the third of 6 children, to a father who came up from the mine every evening with black dust still in the creases of his knuckles, and a mother who kept a kitchen garden and a King James Bible on the same shelf. He picked up a bow for the first time when he was 9 years old, a fiberglass youth Recurve his uncle brought back from a sporting goods store in Middlesboro, and within 2 years he was shooting rabbits in the creek bottom with a consistency that made grown men stop and watch. He enlisted in the army in January of 1967, 1 month before his 19th birthday, because the letter was coming regardless, and he would rather go on his own terms. By the fall of that year he was assigned to the 75th Infantry, Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol, operating out of a firebase in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. LRRP teams went in small, 4 to 6 men, and they went deep, moving through terrain that held things that wanted to kill them, mapping enemy movements, calling in coordinates, getting out alive. The margin for error was a concept that applied to other people's jobs. August Bernard Holloway completed 63 LRRP missions over 2 tours of duty. He was extracted under fire 11 times. He was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross twice, received it once, and never told his wife about either nomination. The commendation letter was in a shoebox in the top shelf of the bedroom closet, still in its original envelope, sealed. He came home in 1971 with a slight tremor in his left hand that went away after about 5 years, a knee that predicted rain more accurately than the Weather Channel, and the Bear Kodiak Hunter, which had been legally his since 1966, and which he had carried overseas on his own cognizance and brought home the same way. He had used it, not in combat, not formally, but in the way that men in those situations used what they knew, which is a story for a different time, and one he never volunteered. After Vietnam, he worked 31 years as a mine safety inspector for the state of Kentucky, raised 2 daughters with his wife Carolyn, who passed of ovarian cancer in 2019, and shot his recurve in the back field every morning before. Work for most of those years, the same 45 minutes, the same methodical practice, the way other men did push-ups or said prayers. He shot in regional traditional archery events through the 1980s and 1990s and had a case of plaques and small trophies in the basement that he kept face down so the grandchildren wouldn't ask questions he'd have to answer humbly. He had not competed in 11 years. He came to Kettle Creek because his youngest daughter had found the registration form on the kitchen table and filled it out herself and mailed it before he could object. The Kettle Creek Bowman 3D Invitational ran 30 stations set through a 200-acre property in the river bottoms of eastern Kentucky. Foam animal targets positioned at distances and angles designed to replicate real hunting conditions. Unknown distances. You ranged the target with your eye, the way it had always been done before rangefinders made guessing unnecessary. The scoring was tight. A 10-ring hit on a 12-inch vital zone, cold, uphill, through a screen of river birch, was worth 10 points. A miss was 0. The compound shooters, with their sights and their release aids and their arrow rests that cradled the shaft like a cradle, shot their first round in the early morning flight. They were good. Jeff Sutter went clean through the first 8 stations, his arrows grouping inside a fist at 40 yards, his mechanics so repeatable. They looked mechanical in the truest sense. August Bernard Holloway was assigned to the late morning flight. He arrived at Station 1, a foam mule deer, quartering away, set at what the target judge said was unknown distance, but which was, by the lean of the shadow and the width of the target chest, somewhere between 38 and 42 yards, and he stood at the stake for a long moment before he nocked an arrow. He did not range the target with any instrument. He stood still, the way a man stands still when he is reading something that cannot be measured, and then he drew the Kodiak Hunter to his corner of his mouth the old instinctive way, held for less than a second, and released. The cedar arrow crossed the gap and hit the 10-ring. The target judge, a retired electrician named Don Wakefield, who had been running 3D shoots for 20 years, looked at the arrow location, looked at August Bernard Holloway, and wrote something down on his clipboard without saying anything. Station 2 was a foam black bear, frontal, angled slightly left, set behind a deadfall at a distance that came to 46 yards by most estimates. The compound shooters in the morning flight had averaged 8 and 9 points on it. The frontal angle on a bear target was considered one of the harder presentations in 3D because the vital zone narrowed to a band across the chest, and the foam construction created inconsistent penetration feedback on near misses. August Bernard Holloway stood at the stake, looked at the bear, and shot it through the center of the chest. 10 points. By Station 5, Don Wakefield had stopped writing between shots and started watching instead. By Station 8, 3 other competitors who had finished their own rounds had drifted back through the course to follow along, not making much noise about it, just appearing at successive stations the way people appear when something is happening that they don't want to miss. Jeff Sutter was one of them. He had heard about the old man from a scorer at the turnaround tent, a one-sentence description that he replayed in his head. The guy with the old recurve, no sight, cedar arrows, and something in it made him walk back upstream through the course instead of heading to the results table. He arrived at Station 11 in time to see August Bernard Holloway shoot a foam wild boar through a 7-inch gap between 2 sycamore trunks at 31 yards, hitting the 10-ring at the near edge of a steep downhill presentation. Sutter stood at the edge of the shooting lane and watched the old man pull the arrow from the foam and replace it in the canvas quiver, without ceremony, without looking around, without any expression that acknowledged an audience. Sutter looked at Brendan Coyle, who had materialized beside him from somewhere. Coyle didn't say anything. The stations progressed. 12 was a foam pronghorn at 55 yards, the longest shot on the course, set on an open hillside with no cover between the stake and the target. Distance estimation at that range without instruments was the kind of skill that either existed or didn't, built over years of shooting at real animals in real terrain, with real consequence for error. Most traditional shooters averaged 6 or 7 points at Station 12. A miss at that range wasn't embarrassing, it was expected. August Bernard Holloway stood at the 55-yard stake. He estimated it at 53, which is what it actually was, though the difference was academic, and drew the Kodiak hunter and shot the pronghorn through the 10-ring. Don Wakefield had stopped pretending to be neutral about this. Behind him now, 7 or 8 people had gathered, and they were not talking. They were watching with the quiet attention that a range develops when something worth witnessing is occurring. A silence that was different from the ordinary silence between shots, heavier somehow, more intentional. The last 5 stations were set in heavy timber along the creek bottom, foam targets placed in low light and broken sight lines, the kind of shooting that rewarded patience and punished haste. August Bernard Holloway moved through them the way he had moved through 63 patrols in a jungle that was darker and quieter and considerably more consequential than a creek bottom in Harlan County. He did not hurry. He did not announce his shots. He knocked, drew, settled, and released, and the cedar arrows went where they were sent. When he walked out of the timber to the final scoring table, he had a 297 out of a possible 300. He had dropped 3 points on a single station, a foam turkey, set at 39 yards, shot through an aperture of branches that left a 6-inch window, where his arrow had clipped the edge of the 10-ring and scored an 8. He accepted the score without comment. The match leader at that point was Jeff Sutter with a 281. Don Wakefield posted the scores on the results board and stood back. There was a silence at the scoring tent that lasted long enough to become something other than silence. Brendan Coyle was standing 15 feet from August Bernard Holloway when the scores went up. He read the board. He looked at the old man, who was drinking coffee from a thermos he'd brought from the truck, his back to the crowd. Coyle opened his mouth and closed it. There was nothing that fit. It was an older woman who spoke first. Her name was Vera Munsey, and she was 61 years old, and she had driven down from Pikeville because her late husband had shot with the Kettle Creek Bowman for 30 years before his stroke, and she came to the Invitational every October as a way of feeling close to something he had loved. She was not a competitor. She was standing near the refreshment table with a paper cup of cider, and she had watched the last 6 stations from the tree line. She walked to where August Bernard Holloway was standing with his thermos, and she said, "Excuse me, I don't mean to intrude, but I'm wondering if I could ask, where did you learn to shoot like that?" He looked at her. He had eyes that had been watching things at a distance for a long time, the kind of eyes that developed in men who had to distinguish between what was dangerous and what merely looked dangerous. He considered her question the way a man considers something when the honest answer is complicated. "My uncle showed me the basics," he said. "The rest I figured out on my own." She nodded. There was something in the economy of that answer that she recognized, the particular compression of a life that had been lived in full but was carried privately. "Were you in the service?" she said. Not prying, asking. He took a sip of coffee. "Yes, ma'am. My husband was too, Marines, 68 to 70. He nodded once, the kind of nod that means I know what that cost." She excused herself and walked back toward the refreshment table, and she passed Jeff Sutter on her way, and she said to him, not breaking stride, "That is not the first hard thing that man has done in his life." And she kept walking. Sutter stood there for a moment. Then he walked to where August Bernard Holloway was standing and stopped about 8 feet away, and he started to say something easy, something about the shooting, a compliment designed to reset the morning, and then he stopped because the easy thing felt wrong, and he started over. "Sir," he said, "I was one of the guys laughing at you in the parking lot this morning. I want to tell you that was wrong. I'm sorry." August Bernard Holloway looked at him. It was the same look he had given the weather, measuring, not judging, and then something in his face relaxed by a very small degree. "You didn't know," he said. "Most people don't." "What didn't I know?" Sutter said. It was a genuine question, asked the way a young man asks something when he senses he is about to learn the thing he actually needs. August Bernard Holloway was quiet for a moment, not from reluctance, but from the habit of a man who had learned to choose words carefully in the dark. "That the bow doesn't make the archer," he said. "The 1,000 mornings make the archer. The bow just comes along." Brendan Coyle had walked up beside Sutter. He heard the last part. He didn't say anything, but he reached out and shook August Bernard Holloway's hand, and held it a beat longer than a regular handshake, the way people hold on when they're trying to say something they don't have the language for yet. Don Wakefield, who had been watching all of this from the scoring table, with the clipboard pressed against his chest like a shield, walked over and offered his hand as well. Then the other competitors came, one at a time, not in a rush, not with speeches. Some of them just shook his hand. Some of them said thank you without specifying what they were thanking him for, because they weren't entirely sure themselves. Only that something had shifted on the range that morning, and they could feel it, and they did not want to let it pass unmarked. One young man, 24 years old, a pipefitter from Corbin named Marcus Alden, who had been shooting compounds for 3 years and had never in his life seen a recurve hit the 10 ring at 55 yards, took off his hat and held it in both hands. In front of him, the way people hold hats at funerals and memorials, without thinking about it, just because the body knows. August Bernard Holloway accepted every handshake the same way, quietly, without ceremony. He did not offer the details of his service. He did not produce the silver star that was framed in a box in his bedroom closet, or the letters of commendation that his daughters knew existed, but had never been permitted to read, or any of the 63 stories that most men in his position would have used to fill the silence comfortably. He had carried those things for 50 years without public inventory, and he was not going to start now. Before he packed the Kodiak Hunter into the truck, he turned to the group that had gathered, 14 people, competitors and visitors, ranging from Marcus Alden at 24 to Vera Muncie at 61, and he said one thing. He had not planned to say anything, but the faces asked for it, and he owed them at least one sentence. "I shoot this bow," he said, "because the men I served with never got to come home and practice anything. So I practice for them." Then he lifted the old bare Kodiak Hunter into its case, latched the lid, and slid it into the wooden tool chest in the truck bed. He climbed into the cab with the careful economy of a man whose knee predicts rain, and he drove out of the Kettle Creek Bowman range the same way he had arrived, alone, unhurried, without fanfare. Jeff Sutter stood in the parking lot watching him go. Brendan Coyle was beside him. Neither man said anything. The Chevy pickup turned left onto the county road and was gone behind the tree line, the cracked rear window catching a last slant of October light. Don Wakefield walked back to his clipboard. He looked at the score sheet for a long time before he remembered to put it away. 3 weeks later, the Kettle Creek Bowmen announced a new division in their annual invitational, traditional unrestricted, and they named the perpetual trophy after no one, just titled it the Quiet Standard, which is a phrase nobody could explain the origin of, though everyone who had been there that morning understood it without needing to. August Bernard Holloway received the notification by mail and read it at the kitchen table with his morning coffee, and set it beside the salt shaker, and went to his back field to shoot his daily 45 minutes, the same as every other morning, the same cedars, the same canvas quiver, the same bare Kodiak Hunter worn smooth at the grip. His daughter called that evening to ask if he had seen the letter. He said yes. She asked what he thought. He said it was nice of them. She said, "Daddy, do you know what you did out there?" There was a pause on the line, and she could hear him breathing, and then he said, "I shot my bow, sweetheart, same as I always do." And that was all he said about it. Jeff Sutter drove to Kettle Creek the following Saturday and asked Don Wakefield if anyone knew how to reach the old man from Harlan County, because he had been thinking about the conversation in the parking lot for 3 weeks, and he still wasn't done thinking about it. Don gave him the number. Sutter called. August Bernard Holloway answered on the third ring, the careful way people answer when they don't recognize a number, and Sutter introduced himself and said he was hoping to come down sometime and just watch him shoot. There was a pause. "You can come down," August Bernard Holloway said, "but you'll have to get here by 6. That's when I start." Sutter was there at 5:50. He stood at the edge of the back field in the dark and watched the sky lighten, and when August Bernard Holloway stepped out the back door at exactly 6 o'clock, with the Kodiak Hunter and the canvas quiver, neither man felt the need to explain to the other what they were doing there. They stood in the cold field together, the old man and the young one, and the old man shot his arrows in the grey morning light, one after another, measured and unhurried, cedar shafts disappearing into foam targets at the distances he had paced off himself years ago, and Sutter watched without asking questions, because some things are not learned by asking. Marcus Alden, the young pipefitter from Corbin, signed up for the next Kettle Creek Invitational. So did Brendan Coyle, who was building his first recurve bow in his garage over the winter, following a pattern he had found in a 1963 edition of a traditional archery manual he ordered from a used book dealer in Tennessee. He told his wife it was just a new project, but she could tell by the way he talked about it that it was something else. She didn't ask. She figured he would get around to explaining it eventually. He did about 2 months later at the kitchen table, while the bow was in pieces on a workbench in the garage, and he was trying to put into words what had happened on a range in October that he could not quite stop thinking about. There was this old man, he said, and he had this bow. She waited. And he was just better, Coyle said. Not because of the bow, just because of him, because of how long he'd been at it and what he'd been through and the fact that he never once told us any of it. He just showed up and shot. She nodded. She had heard this kind of story before, in slightly different forms about different people. They were always the same story underneath. That's the kind of man he is, she said. Coyle thought about it. Yeah, he said. That's exactly it. Some skills outlast the youth that built them. Some men carry things for 50 years that would break the rest of us in 5, and they carry them without complaint, without exhibition, and then they walk into an ordinary Saturday morning and show you what they're made of, not because they wanted to prove anything, but because they can't be anything other than what they are. August Bernard Holloway still shoots his backfield every morning at 6 o'clock. He is 76 years old. The Kodiak hunter has one more crack in the shelf leather now, patched with a strip of electrical tape that he has not bothered to replace with anything more elegant. The cedar arrows are still hand-fletched. The canvas quiver still hangs off his left shoulder the same way it always has. The 1,000 mornings made the archer. Every single one. If this story reached something in you, if you believe the quiet ones deserve to be seen, subscribe to Echoes of Sacrifice. We find these men and women before the world forgets them, and we tell their stories while there is still time to tell them right. Type the word service one more time in the comments. Share this with someone who has never watched an old man shoot a recurve bow, because they might not understand yet what they're actually watching. And the next time you see someone at a range or a field or a court or a course who looks like they don't belong, who's too old, too slow, too quiet, with equipment that seems to belong to another era, sit down, be patient, and pay attention. The ones who have already done it for real are almost always the ones who don't feel the need to tell you so.